Joining us on this edition of the News Review, we have historian, political analyst, and author Mr. Marcus Papadopoulos, who's joining us from the British capital, London. Also, we have journalist Dmitry Zolotarev joining us from Irkutsk. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. Papadopoulos. In London, Ukraine has been very quick to condemn Russia for the missile strike without giving any evidence so far, and use the opportunity to once again call for a no-fly zone. AP, on the other hand, has now quoted U.S. officials as saying that initial findings indicate that the missile was indeed fired by Ukrainian forces at an incoming Russian missile. What are your thoughts on the situation so far?
Whilst it is all but confirmed by the American government that the missile which landed on Polish territory was a Ukrainian one, nonetheless, it is very important to note that had the missile been a Russian one, Article 5 of the NATO Charter would not have been invoked, because Article 5 does not provide for a missile entering the airspace of a NATO member state unintentionally. Therefore, had the missile have been a Russian one, it would have been unintentionally fired into Polish airspace. The Americans, who are the de facto leader of NATO, would know that. We must be abundantly clear that America and Russia enjoy numerous channels of communication with one another to ensure that a nuclear war between the two superpowers never erupts. And I have absolute faith in the Americans that when it comes to working with their Russian colleagues to prevent a nuclear war between themselves erupting, that they will do so. The Americans and the Russians will not allow anyone or any country in the world to incite a war between themselves. Indeed, on a number of occasions, the Americans have disciplined in private some of their own allies in the world for potentially trying to escalate a dangerous situation into an even far more dangerous situation, which could have resulted in a war between America and Russia. So, for example, the Americans disciplined the British during the Suez Canal Crisis, and the Americans also disciplined the British during NATO's bombardment of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Now, that takes me on to my last submission. Whilst it is irrefutably the case that Zelensky is an American and British puppet, nevertheless, it can be argued that perhaps Washington and London are starting to lose some control over Zelensky, because even before an investigation was launched last night to ascertain the origin of the missile which landed in Poland, Zelensky was calling for NATO to take military action against the Russian Federation. And hypothetically speaking, NATO action against Russia would result in a conventional war between America and Russia, which would rapidly escalate into nuclear Armageddon between America and Russia. So I certainly believe that in private, the Americans are becoming increasingly concerned by Zelensky. As I said, the Americans and the Russians will not allow anyone or any country to try and incite a nuclear war between themselves.
Let's cross over to Mr. Zolotarev. Moscow has said that the missile strike in Poland is an attempt to provoke a direct military clash between Russia and NATO. How do you see the possibility of that being a deliberate provocation?
Well, it'll be a deliberate provocation or some sort of mistake or machine failure. both ways are absolutely possible. First of all, there's no wonder that Zelensky is hysterical. This blood-stained and doped to the gills clown is desperately tries to pull NATO countries into the conflict, starting with Poland. And if Poland invades, well, there was a question of stepping in of Poland and some so-called coalition of willing countries to help Ukraine, but this is nothing more than a fraud, because there is no ground for that, and they have no forces. And everybody understands that everybody is, I'm meaning a sane person, understands that if NATO steps into this conflict, Zelensky is good as dead. So he wouldn't survive a day, because in this case, Russia would right away strike the centers of decisions in the Ukraine, and nothing, well, even God wouldn't step in to help him. So Zelensky and his, anyone is, whoever is around him in Kiev, understand that. But I know for sure, and I believe he has a lot of Western advisors there. So I think that more likely these two projectiles have been launched just not deliberately, but by mistake, which is understandable because their air defense systems are going old, and they cannot be operated properly because they have been serviced long ago, and they are serviced at the plants, and the plants are in Russia. So, and it's absolutely clear that both explosions in Poland were not caused by any Russian system. This is simple math,
right?
School math, which is absolutely clearly shows that Russia is absolutely have nothing to do with that. Even Joe Biden, well, admitted that, maybe, but not himself. Someone told him to say so, but you see.
I'm going to stay with you, Mr. Zolotarev. How do you evaluate, you mentioned Joe Biden here, how do you evaluate the reactions of different states in this incident? NATO is holding an emergency meeting, but the Western leaders have reacted with caution.
Well, NATO, the first thing, the main thing, which any NATO country doesn't want, and the whole NATO doesn't want, is stepping in to have any kind of war with Russia. It's not necessarily that conventional war with Russia would immediately erupt and spin off into a nuclear Armageddon. Not necessarily, but NATO knows that it does have nothing to stay in front of Russia for a long time. They wouldn't survive. They don't have logistics. They don't have infrastructure. They have nothing. They don't have weapons. They didn't expect, I believe, Russia to mobilize its reservists, because we haven't seen that from, let's say 1941. But Putin did that, and now Russia has great power in Ukraine, not far from closest border with NATO countries. So Americans, let's say 101 Airborne Division in Poland, and 50,000 Poles, and some southern of Romanian, sorry, not Roman, Romanian troops, they cannot do anything with against Russians. So Russia does have every advantage against them. So they do understand that, and they are there just to have a leash on some stupid politicians in Poland and Romania, and not to do anything to pull them into war. And every show off in UN or in the press, mainstream media, Western media, any show off that will step in, Russia will fight you if you do this, if you do that. Ukraine, we are with you. There is nobody but themselves. They are protecting themselves.
Right.
They are already fed up with Ukraine up to the gills. So
Okay.
I don't see any perspective of war with NATO and the United States.
And one last question for Mr. Papadopoulos in London. For some time now, there have been concerns about a battlefield miscalculation leading to a direct conflict involving NATO. Does this incident, in your opinion, show that those concerns might be justified?
There is always the possibility of an accidental war breaking out between NATO and Russia. However, as I said moments ago, the Americans and the Russians are the two most powerful nations on the planet. They have great responsibilities bestowed on them to ensure that a nuclear war will never erupt. And in light of that, there will be no war between NATO and Russia because America, the de facto chief of the Western military bloc, will not allow that to happen. Zelensky knows in private that Russia will win the war in Ukraine. If need be, Russia can call up 25 million soldiers. That Russia had to carry out a tactical withdrawal from the right bank of the river Dnipro in the Kherson Oblast was a setback, and an agonizing setback, given that Russian soldiers had died capturing it and had died defending it. But in war, setbacks are an inevitability. Also, in war, land is captured, lost, and recaptured. The stark reality for Zelensky and NATO is that Russia has the manpower, Russia has the defense industry, Russia has the will to win in Ukraine. And now that the Russian army is in Ukraine, there is no doubt whatsoever, in my estimation, that Russia will emerge victorious and that the Russian army will capture each and every oblast in Ukraine, including Lvov, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, Rivne, and Volyn. That is the reality. The Americans know that, though at the same time, the Americans are trying to weaken Russia, but simultaneously, the Americans and the Russians, they talk 24/7, each day of each week, of each month, of each year, to avert a nuclear war. That is something that the ignorant, unintelligent men and women of Western mainstream media are simply not aware of. And even if they were aware of that, they wouldn't care. Why? Because they are only guided by status and money. That is why we need to be enlightened, and we need to always remember that America and Russia are tasked with ensuring a nuclear war never breaks out. And as I said, I have absolute faith and trust in the Americans and in the Russians that they will do so. They've been doing it ever since the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they will continue to do so in the future.
Thanks a lot, gentlemen. Marcus Papadopoulos joining us from London, and Dmitry Zolotar joining us from Irkutsk. With that, it brings us to an end here on this edition of the News Review, but do stay tuned. There's plenty more to come here on Press TV. See you in a bit.